In today's episode of the Refuge Pod, Josh has a great and fascinating conversation with Tyler Sitt, who is an Asian American queer author and pastor who recently wrote Staying Awake, the Gospel for Change Makers. And just listening to this conversation, it's very clear that Tyler is a change maker. I love his insight on contemplative Christianity, on decolonial ways of being and church planting, on identity. I mean, Tyler just really gets into it, particularly from the lens of being Asian American and being queer, a very important intersection to dive into during this time in society and in life and in the world. And in the beginning of the conversation, Tyler talks about this idea of how Christianity in itself has a contemplative tradition that isn't talked about. And I thought that that was such a great way to start the conversation, because he really does lean into this reflective way of being, whether it's through interfaith dialogue or whether it's through the fact that queer folks are inherently spiritual. And I think the same is true for many folks of color who spirituality is survival. And so I hope that as you listen to this episode, that you dive into this idea of contemplation and reflection, and you do realize that there are so many ways of connecting with the divine and so many ways of interacting and reflecting on the sacredness of our identities and the sacredness of everyday life. So I hope that you enjoy this episode, and we'll chat more after the conversation.
Awesome. So we'll dive in then. Thank you so much, Tyler. Welcome to the Refuge Pod. So happy, excited, and grateful to have one of our very first guests, somebody who I look up to, wow. Tyler Sitt. Welcome.
So good to be here. Whoop, whoop.
Whoop, whoop. Thank you for being here. Thank you. Tyler, for those who don't know you, can you just tell us a little bit about who Tyler Sitt
is? So I'm the church planter and pastor of New City Church in South Minneapolis. I'm also the author of... I'm reaching to go get it. I'm the author of Staying Awake, the Gospel for Change Makers, which is available through any place that you buy books. And I am an Asian American. I identify as gay or a part of the queer community. And it's awesome to be here.
Yes. Thank you for just scratching the surface and your story and introducing yourself and for being here with us. Can't wait to dive in more. Where did you grow up,
good old
Tyler?
Minnesota.
And okay. Where are you now?
I grew up in a mostly Republican town in Minnesota, outside the city, and it was like an amazing place in so many ways, except for a couple of key ways. There was a great theater program as part of my school system, and also like a tough place for a queer person of color to grow up in some identity politic kind of ways.
I bet. And you're still there now, pretty much, right?
Yeah, Minneapolis, baby. The land of 10,000 lakes.
Yes.
Minneapolis is amazing, by the way. I feel like a lot of times people don't give it... I mean, obviously in the past year, it's gotten a lot of attention for the rampant like racism and destruction that's here, but there's also some really rad things happening in Minneapolis. So I am happy to call this home.
Yes. Beautiful place. I've been there a couple of times, and so amazing. It's, especially I've only been to the Twin Cities, never anywhere else in Minneapolis, but a beautiful place for sure. And, just through you've got into to kind of learn a little bit more about, some of the awesome work happening on the ground, especially faith-based work, right? Through your church that you mentioned, New City, and of course this awesome book that you just read. And shout out to those who are watching this, not just listening, because we've been holding up and representing Staying Awake here. Highly recommend it, and can't wait to talk about it a little bit more. So you mentioned your church planter. What's your faith tradition, kind of faith background? Can you share a little bit about your spiritual tradition, please.
During kind of my like college seminary years, though, I took a deep dive into interfaith conversations as well as like the Zen Buddhist tradition. So I taught English with indigenous folks in Ecuador, and I lived in Israel Palestine for a little bit, and I live with the Tibetan Buddhist community of the Dalai Lama in Dharamsala, India, and also like did some like a mindfulness retreat with Thich Nhat Hanh in France. And I think that was a really important part of my journey because there was like a contemplative gap that I was feeling in my faith formation from my early days, that for that stage of life, like Buddhism was really helpful for that. Ultimately, though, after really like a 9-year kind of walkabout, I realized, though, that Christianity is like my heart song, and it's how I connect to God, and my faith in Jesus is like the core mooring of my life, and Buddhism was kind of there to give me tools for my inner life, but I realized that Christianity in itself has a contemplative tradition that just no one told me about until later on. But it turns out that there's been a lot of contemplative Christians over the years, and they've really helped me to kind of like excavate some of my interior life and to root myself back in the life of Jesus.
That's beautiful. So such an amazing opportunity, right, to go and learn from other traditions and cultures. And I'm curious if you have other tidbits of, wisdom and like you just mentioned, this helped you to even see the own contemplative history in the Christian tradition, right? Are there other things that help to kind of strengthen your own faith tradition, spirituality, and even as a pastor and church planter?
I mean, I don't know. There's kind of this sense that, especially in like the more conservative branches of the Christian family, there's kind of this sense that if we allow exposure to other faiths, that's dangerous because they'll like persuade or argue against or like convince people to not be Christian. And I found the exact opposite to be true. When I was living in Dharamsala, India with the Tibetan Buddhist community, I would, like people would come knocking on my dorm door and be like, so you really believe that there's a soul? Like really, like you honestly believe that a soul exists that like is assigned to one person? And I had to kind of like, I had no Wi-Fi, I had none of my textbooks, I had a Bible and my experience. And I really had to like talk through to someone from a completely different worldview what I believed. And that process made me a whole lot more Christian. So like, I think we should approach interfaith conversations as an opportunity to become more Christian. And I think that if we're worried about interfaith conversations making people less Christian, that's probably an indication of like a fault line within someone's own faith that they don't want to like put stress on, rather than the interfaith communication being problematic in itself.
Yeah, absolutely. That's so beautiful. I come out of more conservative Christian tradition. I'm a plethora of all the Christian traditions, growing up Roman Catholic and then like Pentecostal and very conservative, legalistic. Now, as we talked the other day, also involved with the United Methodist Church, and I think I totally agree with what you said. I think it's huge, how it strengthens us, and really, it reminded me of an experience. My partner Gracias used to work with the interfaith organization out here in LA called Clue that works heavily in the labor field, and so beautiful, to see and really get to appreciate other traditions, right? And ultimately see that we have so much more in common that separates us. But those things that are different, we can highlight and celebrate rather than, try to convince the other people, right, to believe what we believe. and it made me think of like, what is the ultimate goal of faith, right? Is it just to like believe a certain thing, and like in the Christian tradition, we often emphasize, getting to the other world, right? Or to the afterlife. Or is it like how we live our lives here, right? And how we work together for justice and for, loving our neighbors and, just being in solidarity. And that's such a amazing, beautiful experience. And I see it, reflective in the work that you're up to now. So I'm excited to dive into that more. I also want to, you mentioned, being part of the queer community, right? As a person of color that is, gay and a pastor, like, again, like for people that, might have come out of more conservative legalistic traditions that can't like fathom the two things. Like, I would love for you to share a little bit more of how that experience has been for you. Has it been challenging? Has it been easy?
I mean, in my book, in the third chapter, there are 9 chapters and they're each dedicated to a different Christian practice. And so the third chapter is on prayer. And I talk about how, in my experience, queer people are particularly spiritual people. Like, queer people are folks who, when we were like 8, 11 years old, we had to answer questions that were really big. Like, do I belong in this universe? Is there a place for me? And these like profound questions, while having to address them with the emotional competencies of an 11-year-old. So I just kind of feel like so many queer people I meet, whether they identify as in a particular faith or not, have a certain like spiritual aptitude to be able to talk about connecting to something larger than ourselves, because for many of us, we had to connect to something larger than ourselves to survive at just our teenage years. And I think for that reason, when I went to Candler School of Theology, there was a lot of queer people there. Like, there was more, there was like a disproportionate number of queer people in my seminary and in many of the United Methodist seminaries. And I think the reason why that is because queer people have like an experiential knowing of the Holy Spirit that drives us towards something that looks like creating church, whether or not it's formally called that, depending on our denominational tradition.
That's so beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. And can you share a little bit more too about your own personal journey of, you mentioned that as a young kid, like, was that tough coming out and, again, like saying like, I want to be a pastor? Yeah,
it was a lot easier to say I want to be a pastor than to come out of the closet. I think that for me, the experience of being in the closet, actually, physiologically, I don't know if this is maybe folks who are listening to this can share in the comments if this was your experience, but for me, coming out of the closet and becoming a Christian were like physiologically very similar experiences. Like, both when I came out of the closet to my mom the first time, the summer between 8th and 9th grade, and when I became a Christian, I had like a physical bodily reaction of like my heart pounding. I was like, my palms were sweaty. I had to go to the bathroom to wash my hands. And there was just kind of this feeling of like, something just happened that will permanently change my life. Like, no matter what goes down in the next like lifetime, I'll never be able to unsay that I'm gay to people, because that's been said. And I'll never be able to like undo the work that Christ has done in my heart to be a Christian. And I think that that feels like really high stakes for a teenager. Like, oh my gosh, I can't even like vote yet, and I just like made 2 permanent decisions in my life. But at the same time, it was, I guess in seminary the word would be a theophany, where there's kind of this like fearful, awesome presence of God that's like God saying to me, like, I'm changing your name. Like you're permanently going to live into a different identity because of these choices. And that's the will and the transformation of God. And I think that's, I'm really grateful for that because, I grew up in a Republican town. My family was supportive in large part because my parents could kind of tell that their child may be queer. Kind of early on, they started doing some of that wrestling. And so I had support in the household and then support in certain pockets of my social circles in the town I grew up in. But otherwise, it was like, people driving by me and rolling down their window and shouting queer at me or faggot at me as they drive by, or people kind of intimidating me or bullying me in high school. And I really think that, like, if God hadn't moved so profoundly in my life, that would have been a lot more troubling for me. But there was something about like the anchor hold of God that was like, man, like these like violent 15-year-olds they're not Lord of the universe. And like, I know a God who moved so deeply in my life that I'm permanently transformed for the better. And like, haters gonna hate otherwise. And I think that like, it was really important that all of those experiences kind of came together. Like that I had that theophany before a lot of the bullying started, because it really helped me endure that.
That's so beautiful, Tyler. Thank you so much for sharing that. We have a group called the People of Color Theology Group, and I'm so excited that we're reading your book next, but we're just wrapping up. That's right. Yep. We are wrapping up Howard Thurman's Jesus and the Disinherited. Yes. And in the last two chapters, the second and last is about hate, and the last one is about love. And, he's kind of wrapping up like this, exactly what you're talking about, like how he talks about the disenfranchised, right? Being hated so much, through, of course, in this, he's talking about race, but I think it applies in so many ways, right? All xenophobia. Being hated so much that they cannot see themselves in any other way besides the hate that they experience, right? That marginalization, that dehumanization, right? And it reminds me of what he says love is, it is that ability to see beyond the hate and the rejection, right? That, society puts on us, whatever that may be, right? For a plethora of reasons. And so that's so beautiful. And it's so encouraging,
and I just think,
thank you for sharing that.
I was just reflecting on,
no, please.
I think that there were two types of hate, as far as identity-based hate. There were two types of hate in my growing up, and certainly like there was more vocal and violent aggression towards me as a queer person. But there was a different type of aggression that I think is common for many Asian Americans, especially Asian Americans growing up where there's not a lot of Asian Americans, which is the violence of erasure. And both of them are just different paths that lead to the same kind of hatred that Howard Thurman talks about, which is like ultimately being unable to see yourself. It's just that the more like aggression type of violence forces you to see yourself as like a liability or as a target. And the erasure path of violence kind of forces yourself to not even see that you exist at all. So I think that a lot of like my Asian American experience is not marked by what happened, but what didn't happen. Like I didn't get like really any education in my school about what it means, what the Asian American experience has been like at all. I didn't connect to other community members who could pass on ancestral wisdom because there weren't a lot of Chinese folks in the place where I was. And I didn't get to find like a rootedness or groundedness in my racial identity. And I'm realizing in retrospect that each of those things are just as damaging. They're just not as reportable. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. What would you say, like the percentage of Asian or Chinese, American people were, like, where you grew up?
I know that in Minneapolis, I would guess it's like 5 or 10%, but I was outside of the city, so I can remember like 2 other Asian people in my class, 5 out of like 1,000.
Wow.
Maybe I'm exaggerating that, but it wasn't a ton. And a lot of them were transracial adoptees. Yeah. So like, even though they themselves were people of color, they likewise didn't have tradition passed on to them. Or like there just kind of wasn't a sense of like Asian American identity being something to organize around. And I think like each of those present a different type of violence.
Right. Yeah, I can imagine. And so where did you find, you mentioned a little bit, but I would love to, if you could expand, please, on like, where have you found encouragement and like, again, like this alternative way of loving yourself and other people? I think it's so profound. And like, how have you been able to do that despite the, growing up in a place like that, and, despite the marginalization and the discrimination, right? That the world often puts on us.
Yeah. So first of all, I think that one of the dimensions of privilege that I have that many people in the queer community don't have is, like I mentioned, my family was supportive of me, basically from jump. Like my dad, I think needed some like brain space to apply this to how he understands the world as someone who grew up in Hong Kong. But like my immediate family, like the people I shared a house with, were very safe. And I think that like there is so much privilege in being able to know like whatever happens during the day, at nighttime I'm gonna feel love. And so like I want to just name that there's like lots of other folks who didn't have that experience in the queer community. The other thing that I wanted to name is like I was always like having profound spiritual experiences as a kid. Like I remember when I was a kid going around and like opening up all the windows and blinds, and my parents were like, "What are you doing, Tyler?" And I was like, "I want to see God." Like there was just kind of this like clear connection that there was a God out there who wanted to connect with me. And I experienced that in nature. I experienced that in church, in different ways through like music and dance. And like all of those things, I think really buoyed me, because it was like, I'm touching base with something that is so much more powerful than the adversity that I'm facing.
That's beautiful. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. I also want to ask if you could share any other words of encouragement for people that are struggling, whether it's through race, gender, sexuality, or anything, like you mentioned, that's so beautiful that your parents were accepting of you, right? And you had that love at home, that safety and security. But for people that maybe not, are not experiencing that, like, do you have any sources of wisdom or encouragement to share?
So, first of all, I want to name all of your experiences. Like God can resurrect all of your experiences into ministry. So like as people are facing these hardships and these adversities, and truly like most people at New City are people who one way or the other, either because of racial identity, sexual orientation, gender identity, or like being harmed by purity culture in the evangelical church. Like a lot of folks at New City Church are kind of trying to put the pieces together. And I just want to name, like, there is something beautiful that can come from all of these things. And like, I think that sometimes when people have a lot of harm in our lives, it's kind of like, that felt like it was wasted time, or like I was owed an experience that I didn't get. And I think that that's true. And I think that like, even the worst poison of the empire can turn into the redemption and resurrection of God, and that happens through like keeping in touch with our body, through things like therapy and being part of a small group and processing through our experiences, and ultimately being able to relate to other people who are going through the same thing, to be able to strive towards wholeness. So I just want to name like, I don't wish any of that harm upon anyone, and the empire is going to do what the empire is going to do. So just know, like, or like kind of have an expectant posture about that. The other thing I just want to reiterate is you're not alone. Like, there's so many people, as rare as your circumstances may be, you're like I've met like Black, trans, rural Pentecostalists who were like sure that they were the only person around, and like God tends to make multiples, like you're the only you, but there's someone else out there who is sharing a similar experience, and once you find each other, there's a really profound solidarity that can come up. So please reach out and find that, and just ultimately, like, whoever is embodying the love of God in your life, like, stick with those people, and to the extent that you can, whoever is like pulling in some empire nonsense into your life, try to avoid that as much as you can. Even though I know that sometimes that's easier to say for adults versus children, or for people who have money versus people who don't. But to the best of your ability, do your best, and God will continue to stay with you.
Yes. Amen to all of that. Thank you for sharing that beautiful encouragement and wisdom. And you touched on it a little bit, but I would love for you to share, please, more of New City Church. Like, why did you start this, and how long has it been around? And tell us more, please.
Yeah, so I moved into my neighborhood not knowing really anyone until in 2015. And I did a prayer walk around every neighborhood in Minneapolis, which admittedly is easier to do in Minneapolis than it is in LA. And I just, I get a little, the traffic is a little different there. And I just like really try to set myself into like a deep knowing and deep relationship to the extent that I could in the time that I had with folks. And eventually I felt called to Powderhorn, and there were kind of 4 non-negotiables for me as far as like starting a church. I should say non-negotiables for me to know that I'm the one who's supposed to start the church. Like, God is calling all types of churches into existence all the time. And so like I just kind of had my personal non-negotiables for me to know whether it's not for me. So one of them is like, it was really important to me that whatever project I was setting myself out on, that it was explicitly Christian. Like, we talked about Jesus, we read the Bible, we like practice the Christian faith. And the reason why that's important to me is because Jesus is part of my theory of change. Like, as a community organizer, like, everyone has a theory of change. And I think in my experience, like, if we remove the practice of following Christ from even our political work, all of that will kind of break down on itself. And if there is something really, in my experience, something really crucial to the Holy Spirit being present in our work. So for me, it was like, there were opportunities to start social justice movements, opportunities to start social services. I bless all that. I'm thankful for all that. And I knew, like, if I can't like really talk about Jesus, then this probably isn't for me, right? The second one is, like I said, I grew up in a multiracial household, and multiracial community building is really important to me because I've seen how it's not only possible, but like desired for by God, as evidenced by my family. So like creating multiracial communities was big. I come from a climate change background, so having there was, or I should say, a climate change activism background. I wasn't like actively causing, like going to the ozone layer and causing climate change. But like it was important to me that there was something to do with the planet. So like whether it was solar panels, recycling bins, compost, environmental justice advocacy, like whatever, that was important to me. And then lastly, that it was located in Minneapolis, because that was the city I felt called to. So yeah, I just kept walking around and talking to people, and then eventually things started picking up. And in November of 2017, we launched a weekly worship service with 137 people, and we just kind of kept going from there. and during COVID, we've been 100% online. So that's a whole, I mean, but that's a whole ride. And we've just been kind of plugging along ever since. I just did want to add one footnote, because this is important also for the church planters who are listening to this. But when I went into the neighborhood, I had coffee with every local pastor who would respond to my emails to talk. So I really tried to talk to the people who were already there and kind of say like, hey, this is kind of the direction I'm thinking. Is this a worthwhile thing? And I kind of gave veto power to the elders in the neighborhood to decide whether or not this was worthwhile. And they kind of said, the people that you want to minister with are not being reached by any of the ministries in South Minneapolis, much less this particular neighborhood. So like you go ahead and we'll refer people to you, and also like be familiar with what we offer so you can refer people to us. So I think that was a really important part of my like decolonial or like post-colonial mindset, was like, okay, I'm not going to assume that I'm the only bringer of the gospel in this space, and that the Holy Spirit is already doing plenty, and it's like kind of my job to listen in on how to hone in on that.
That's huge. That's huge. I knew a little bit about the story, but I didn't know that last part. Thank you so much for sharing that. I think, wow, man, I feel like that's a whole like podcast in itself, right? Just to talk about that experience. I think that's huge. And yeah, thank you for sharing a little bit about New City Church. And you mentioned you're online. Like if people wanted to find it, they could. You're still meeting online. Yeah. This is early June. Happy Pride Month. This month and always, right? Yes.
Yeah.
You all are still.
I mean,
online.
Even if they're listening to this after a lot of time, you can go to grownewcity.church. So that's Grow New City, not .com or .org, but .church/worship, and we have our worship service on our website.
Thanks. Thank you. We'll have that in the show notes too. And thank you for sharing that. Again, what you mentioned earlier, right, about not being alone, I think that's huge. And so many of us are feeling the isolation. And so there's awesome communities out there to plug into, even online, which we know is a real community, So yes, thank you so much for the work you're doing. And I want to, pick up on the book too. Why write this and the timing of it, right? Like being where you're at in Minneapolis, in what we've just gone through in the pandemic and with the assassination of George Floyd. Why write this book? Man.
So, so the origin story was like, I was at New City, I was preaching and teaching, and not only me talking, but like the whole community would be in classes where we kind of constructed theology together and did book groups together or did whatever. And as New City kept rolling, I kept hearing people, like queer people of color, being like, okay, I thought I had completely shut the door on Christianity. And then like I came to New City and now there's like a little crack open of the door to Christianity. So like I do want to learn more. Tell me who I should be reading, and don't you dare recommend a white guy. or like a straight person. Like, don't you dare recommend like a straight cisgender heterosexual white guy. And I mean, like, bless the Lord. I'm glad that that's there. And like, does it have to be 100% of the bookshelf? Like, so like, come on. So I looked at my bookshelf and I saw like amazing seminary texts, like things that were written like at a pretty high level, like really high critical thinking, like really particular vocabulary. So like, okay, those are like ideologically totally aligned, but the language and kind of the tone isn't accessible to folks. Like, there's like a lot of different education levels at New City, and so it's like, I don't want people to feel patronized or like intimidated by a book that's supposed to be showing the way of life, right? I found a lot of memoirs or like kind of like personal stories that in many ways assumed that people kind of knew what Christianity was or like knew what was supposed to happen at church. And I found a lot of like white guy books that were like, okay, there's some helpful stuff in here, but like written from a social location that has zero awareness of marginalization in the world. So it was kind of one of those like, if I could have referred to another book, I definitely would have just like saved the time to do that. But that book really didn't exist. And so when the Forum for Theological Exploration came around and they're like, hey, we're doing a series, first time authors, do you have a book in you? I was like, I could really use like a walkthrough of Christianity that centers queer people of color. So that's what I wrote it as. Like, we look at 9 different Christian practices that are kind of like not assuming that people know why we worship, not assuming that people know how to pray or like why small groups are such a big deal. Like, really, at least I made an effort to, whether or not I was successful, I really tried to make an effort to be like, I assume that you're an intelligent, competent human being who has no background in any of this stuff. So like really trying to go through the actions in that and then teach theology through experience. Like, we're going to talk about the experience of Sabbath, and that's how we're going to learn about how God works in the world and the Holy Spirit. Like, versus, I mean, you know the seminary textbooks that are like, constructive theology, like chapter 3, evil in the world, chapter 4, the kingdom of God. And it's like, yeah, that only works if people want to hear about those things, right? But like, so that's how I did it. And like I said, New City is like very much a community theology kind of place. So I included testimonies from the community, poetry from the community. I included illustrations because visual learning is really an important step of anti-racism. And so, yeah, and like checklist, just like trying to be practical, like checklists of like, this is how to start worshiping at a church. And there's just like a numbered list, not assuming that you know how to do this. So, yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, such a beautiful gift. And again, I started reading it, and I can't wait to read it more with the community. And really, we're going to, at the end of this, like plug, like if you want to read it with us or just read it at all. And also include in the show notes your little promo, which is so awesome on the book. And you mentioning in that promo video that, you like also like, you mentioned not assuming, right? Like people's backgrounds. You mentioned that people that are involved with social justice movements, right? They're not always like plugged in with the church world. And people that are plugged in with the church world are not always involved with social justice movements. And like, I so resonated with that. I've been involved with so many different communities over the years. And what you said earlier about the, like your theory of change involving Jesus and, hence the title, right? The gospel for change makers, right? I think it's so appropriate. And it really speaks to me, and I think so many of us, right, that are looking for changing the world, because I think at the heart and the root of the gospel, that really is
Absolutely.
what it is about, right? It is about not necessarily just like changing our personal lives, but it is a story that has transformed the world. And I just want to acknowledge you and thank you for, paving the way and, building upon those who have come before us and have paved the way, right, for these types of resources that
including
are so
Howard
needed.
Thurman.
So,
Yeah,
again,
like Howard
plug in
Thurman was a
the
huge
heck out of
influence
it.
for me. Yeah,
Yes.
absolutely.
Yes.
Um,
Absolutely. No, it's so beautiful, right? To see, the people that are continuing to write these works that, are really, I think, what we're so hungry for, many of us, who don't necessarily fit into kind of like the colonial Christian story that, Lord knows, unfortunately has continued to dominate what it means to be Christian in the U.S. and around the world. And so just as a way of kind of like wrapping up here, would love to hear if there is like anything else that you would like to share, whether about the book or anything else.
yeah, I mean, I want to loop back on something that you said about justice not necessarily seeing relevance in the church world and the church not necessarily seeing relevance in the justice world. Like, I have a lot of friends and a lot of people I admire and respect who, graduate from high school or graduate from college, get into community organizing, and they're brilliant and talented and hardworking. And just like the nature of the work and the true like brutality that is in like all of these organizing challenge, like trying to go up against systems that like brutalize people who stand up for justice, just really take this toll. And I feel like I've seen, I've been in the neighborhood long enough to see people last in organizing for like 2 years, 3 years, and then they like totally spiral out and get like a job at a bank somewhere, and then they just like show up to like one thing a year. And it's like, I think that part of it was like, if the community of faith, if the gospel, if the practice of Christianity could like revive people, how I know that it can, so that people stay in the fight for longer, then that's already a win for the movement. Like, that's already going to create tons of change. And that's kind of the founding, one of the founding principles for New City, as well as for why I wrote Staying Awake.
So beautiful and so needed. And again, just thank you, Tyler, for, writing this book, the sacrifice and time you've put into it, and the work that you're doing at New City and in Minneapolis. And, totally just want to ask, again, as a way of kind of wrapping up here, like, about specifically being there in this last year, with the world really looking at, right, what has happened. Unfortunately, we know that George Floyd was not the only person, and is not the only person who's been assassinated by police officers, but that whole, you've had a spotlight there. And how has it been to be a person, a faith leader, leading a community and writing this book during that time, and of course we're now in the post time of the conviction, right, of the officer who murdered.
Oh yeah. I mean, so, in the book, there's an epilogue, that explains, so New City is like walking distance from George Floyd Square. So it's like all of that stuff that went down happened in Powderhorn, and the like buildings that burned were on Lake Street. Lake Street is 1 block north of 31st. 31st is where New City meets. Like, there's just like, this was like very much in our world. And I think that my community truly is still unpacking, like, what did we just see, and how did God move among all of it? Because there were, we saw, like, when I say white supremacist, I mean like they left not like swastika banners in the alleys, white supremacists, like militarized, organized white supremacist groups that drove in from all across the country to use our city as a rage room and target businesses of color and post offices and libraries and like the institutions that no one in the neighborhood would have targeted. And so like we saw that. We saw wood soaked in gasoline hidden away in the alleys for people to use for malicious purposes. And I think that there's a certain like undeniability to it of like, this is like militarized white supremacy is undeniably real. Like we've always known that, people of color have always known that, but like, it's like, oh, this is like a new dimension of how real it can be because that restaurant is burning down. So I think like witnessing the horror of that, and then also witnessing the Spirit of God move amazingly in the midst of all of this. Like the ways that neighborhoods organized amongst themselves, the ways that neighborhoods kept themselves safe when they couldn't rely on the police. The way that like a lot of shop owners put plywood up on their windows during the uprising, and muralists across the city just like use this as a blank canvas to transform our city into like a beautiful message of hope and in the midst of all of this. And like we just saw a like real palpable resurrection happening in real time, while also seeing like some of the most wide-scale militarized empire vision that a lot of us have seen before. So we're still kind of unpacking that, but my the epilogue of my book talks about how the manuscript for this book was due like 2 days after the uprising started. So I had written this book that was like, yeah, Christianity helps you in social justice or whatever, and then all of a sudden it was like, prove it, show the receipts. Like if Christianity is going to help during social justice, now's the time to do it. And so I kind of walked through how each of the 9 practices of Christianity had a role in New City's response to the uprisings, and by having that role, like created real outcomes for social justice that were better than would have happened if those practices didn't exist. So like that was a huge learning for me. Like it's kind of a wild thing when you write a book and then there's like a ground zero experiment for you to like really test the arguments underlying it. And then, yeah, I would just briefly say, over the course of the year, Dalal Eid died from police brutality. Dante Wright died in Brooklyn Center, like while the Chauvin trial was going on. And I think that the folks in Minneapolis, I don't know, there was lots of opinions, but generally, like what New City felt was like relief in the absence of what would have happened if there was a not guilty verdict. Like if it was not guilty, that would have been hard. So there was relief in the absence of that, but no one really had the joy or even pretense that there was any measure of like true justice that happened in that. Like at most it was a punishment in the carceral system. Like the folks at New City were like, great, so we've been advocating to defund the police and defund the prison system, and now someone just got sent to go live in a cage in the prison system. Like that doesn't feel like a win for the abolition of God's people. That doesn't feel like a step away from the carceral state and kind of like the heavy mechanisms of empire that are present within that. And so like I think it was deeply unsatisfying for a lot of people, while also, of course, people knowing that if there was a not guilty, like that wouldn't have been good for our community.
Yeah, no, that's so much. And again, this is a whole nother podcast, right? Just talking about this last year, being there. And again, I thank you again for just sharing a little bit for us that are not there, seeing this daily and the work that you all are doing. And you talk a little bit about the book too, right? Just being out there, embodying your spirituality. You're not just theorizing, right, in the four walls of the church, but being out there on the streets and representing that, there is solidarity in the Christian tradition for justice. And, that what you just said, it reminds me of, that it is a restorative justice, right? It is an alternative kind of, where we're talking about love earlier, it is, can't use the same weapons of the empire, right?
Jesus didn't come back to crucify Pontius Pilate. The resurrection wasn't like, you crucified me and now I get to crucify you. The resurrection was like, there's a fundamentally different way for us to relate together as a community. And we see what that looks like in the Pentecost and in Acts 2 and 4. And the mechanisms of the empire will never be able to save the empire from its own undoing. So we have to lean into the Holy Spirit to imagine a new way.
Absolutely. Yes. Giving finger snaps here. Thank you, Tyler. Again, thank you for the time. I know you're super busy, and again, just want to acknowledge you and thank you for taking the time to be on our podcast and share a little bit about your story and work. And so, kind of wrapping up, and friends, I'm not being humble here, but yeah, Tyler is he's doing all these interviews on local news, the New York Times, and for reals, you're amazing. And, just, it's been so inspiring to hear from you. So thank you. Wrapping up here, these are questions that we ask to all of our guests on the podcast. If you could have dinner or lunch, just share a meal, some food and drinks with friends or mentors or people that inspire you that are dead or, passed on into the other world or alive, who would they be?
Jesus, Grace Lee Boggs, maybe Lin-Manuel Miranda, because I love his work, but also I think there's a little too much 7 energy between the two of us. Enneagram 7 energy. Maybe the character of Eliza Schuyler from Hamilton, but not the actual historical Eliza Schuyler, but
okay.
Josh Lopez-Reyes and Howard Thurman. Wait, did I say Howard Thurman already? Yeah, probably Howard Thurman twice if I said it before. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, the double Howard Thurman. Man, that would be a lit party, and I would be so.
Well, you're invited, so.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. I feel honored, and that I wish we could make that happen, maybe one day. Love it. How about refuge? How would you define refuge?
There's a space where joy, the joy of the Lord is the ground of all of our being, and when our feet are fixed on it, that's refuge to me. Yeah.
Beautiful. Thank you for that. Yes. So thank you for this time. Really, it's been a sacred time. It's been such a I've learned more about you, and I feel like every time I talk to you, I learn from you so much. And so thank you for sharing this with others too, and the work you're doing, Tyler.
Adelante,
like we say in Spanish.
Yes.
And blessings. Yes, and of course we're going to plug the hell out of this amazing book. Get your copy. You can get it at. We're going to have all the information in the show notes. So thank you.
Oh, and there is a free
Tyler.
Discussion and action guide to the book on my website, tylersit.com, if you're thinking of groups. Yeah, well, God bless you. Igualmente, adelante. And yes. I just know that God is, there's an upswell of Holy Spirit, something happen in the world. And it's just such an honor to be on this podcast and to be part of what God's doing. So let's move forward together.
Yes, absolutely.
Adios.
Amen. Thank you. All right. Well, thank you for sticking with us through this super exciting, important conversation with Tyler. Thank you so much, Tyler, again, for your time. Something that really stood out to Kat and I as we were debriefing was this idea that, it is actually not harmful for our spirituality, especially folks in the Christian tradition, to have these interfaith dialogues. And actually, Kat, you mentioned something that I want to ask if you could repeat it, please, about God's godness and how it's not like God is not insecure when we dialogue with other faiths. Could you share that again, please?
Yeah, something that I always say is that God is not insecure of God's godness. And I think that we've heard so much, particularly those of us who grew up in evangelical circles, about this, slippery slope, or being so fearful of engaging with whether it's people of other faith, or whether it's other denominations, or whether it's with Christians who we may not quote unquote agree with, right? And people are so afraid to interact because we might lose our faith, or we might, get distracted or whatever. But I think that, man, that just tells me how weak a faith is, right? I love how Tyler talked about the more that he would engage with folks from other religions, or the more that he would engage with folks in general, it forced him to ask questions about his own faith, right? It forced him to really think about what he believes and be able to articulate it. And it made him love his faith more, made him love Jesus more, to be questioned about it by folks from other religions, and not in a judgmental way, right? Just genuinely like, is this, I know he mentioned that someone asked him like, so do you really believe in a soul? And he was like, yeah, I do. And here are the reasons why. And so I just really love that, particularly for folks who are just afraid to, whether it's dive into queer theology or queer ways of thinking, or reading the Bible, or whether it's other forms of theology that we may not be familiar with because of our cultural backgrounds, or, those kinds of things. And so I think that it's so beautiful to remember that God is not insecure about God's godness. Therefore, we don't need to be insecure about God's godness. And, having a robust faith is a faith that, is confident, right, about what it stands on or what it believes.
Yeah, thank you. Love that so much. And again, the more we dialogue, I love how you said with other faiths, right, it could even help us to appreciate our own and what we believe, right, and strengthen it. Right. And again, something that Tyler shared that we both said that really we resonated with was this idea of a theophany, of coming out of the closet, right? This event, this kind of world-changing life event that is coming out of the closet. And he compared that to the identity of becoming a Christian too.
Yeah, I thought that was so deep and so fascinating.
Yeah. I mean, I think, again, what we're saying about the interfaith perspective, right? I think that's so similarly related in that, unfortunately, we know that Christianity has been interpreted to us through a specific lens for the most part, right? White, heterosexual, male, and that's been the case for centuries. And so grateful for theologians like Tyler, like you, Kat, like so many out there that are continuing to raise new theologies in the world that we're living in, that help us to see the divine, that help us to see, again, like a diamond, right, that has these different cuts, and you look at it, and every angle that you look at it has a different perspective. And I think that the beauty of the divine and of life is like that. But unfortunately, we kind of have focused in on one perspective for so long. It's so important, and so grateful for folks like y'all who are emerging and helping us to see new perspectives. And that really stood out to me.
I love that he made that comparison. And I love that he talked about how, God was like sort of changing his name in that moment. Like that was like an identity marker, right? Living into a new identity. Like you can't undo. I love how he talked about, once I sort of accepted, or once I sort of, believed in this Jesus, and I came to know Christ, he's like, I couldn't undo everything that Christ did for me. And I was like, wow, yes, that's so powerful. And then he said, and then once I sat down with my mom and told her, hey, like, I'm gay, I couldn't undo that. Like, that was an identity marker for me. And I think that's so profound, to have such a deep sense of who you are, right? Whether it be who you are as a queer person, who you are as a Christian. Like, this is a new, I'm stepping into this, and maybe not even new for many people, but I'm stepping into this identity. I'm stepping into this and I'm claiming it, right? There's so much power in that. I'm claiming that I'm embracing everything that God did for me, and I'm embracing all of who I am. I thought that was so profound. And and he, how you mentioned, he said that it was like sort of a theophany, right? Like this fearful, awesome presence all of a sudden just made itself known in those two specific areas of his life, but they, of course, they interconnect so beautifully. So I thought that was so profound. I mean, he said so many profound things, but that was certainly one of them.
Yeah, absolutely. And another thing that you and I were talking about, Kat, was this idea of his, kind of decolonial approach to church planting, right? At New City Church, and how he went around and had coffee with all the churches or pastors, in the area where he wanted to plant this church, that were available. And, I've thought about this for so many years, and it always like trips me out when you see, like, you drive down a street, or, walk, if you walk these days, right? And you see like a church in front of a church, and then there's like, you walk down a few more steps and there's another church, and to think like a lot of them are not interacting with each other, they're rather competing with each other. I think that's such a unfortunate, part of Christendom, right? That we have done it, where we've turned it into a competition rather than really like building the beloved community. And thankful for churches like New City Church and the leadership of Tyler that is doing this decolonial approach of really like collaborating. And what he said was like, there was like there are people that he's reaching out to that those churches aren't, and there's people that he could refer to those other churches, right? I think it's beautiful.
I think that him framing it as decolonial was actually really important, because he kind of mentioned, like, I didn't go into a community thinking that I'm bringing the gospel. And I think that, that's so much of what we saw, right? That's what colonialism is. Like, I am introducing you to, this, or I am bringing this to you for the first time. And, he kind of went in with the attitude of like, the Spirit's already moving here. How can I partner, with God? And I love that he said, I gave the elders of the community, those who have already been there, sort of a veto of saying, okay, if this is not like legitimate, if this is not helpful, if this is not what you think, God wants to do here, then like, I'm out, And I thought that framing that as decolonial was really good. Because I say this all the time, but we use the word decolonize as a buzzword. But I think that him, explaining and expressing how he was using a decolonial approach is key. I think it's true because of how we've seen Christianity enter into different communities and spaces, sort of claiming its ownership and its dominance and claiming its whatever over people. I think that taking an approach where it's not lording over people, but it's sort of just, hey, what's God already doing? How's the Spirit already moving, and how can I partner? And I thought that, if there's any church that I want to be a part of, it's certainly one that starts off with that attitude, or even just that posture, I guess you can say.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah, thanks again so much, for sharing some of your thoughts, Kat, and allowing me to do the same. That's a little bit of what stood out to us, to echo Kat. There's so many nuggets of wisdom, and we would love for you to comment in the, wherever you're viewing this or watching this, what stood out to you, what was helpful to you. And again, thanks for sticking with us. As we wrap up here, just want to, again, plug this important book, Staying Awake, by Tyler Sitt, and you will be able to find that in his website, which will be in the show notes. You'll also be able to find New City Church. And so thanks for being with us for another episode. We'll see you all next time.
Thank you.